Welcome to our first of 3 audio lessons on yoga philosophy. This lesson is entitled The Impulse to Seek, the Origin of Yogic Scripture and Themes from the Upanishads. One of the many things that human beings share in common is that in some form or another, we are all seekers. Of course, each of us seeks different things and searches in different ways, and perhaps this is part of what makes our characters distinct from one another. But no matter how different we are on the level of character, culture, or personality, every one of us has this impulse, which then begins the long and often arduous process towards finding. In this process, one thing is certain. Once I know what I am looking for, the journey begins in earnest. If I were to trace the arc of this journey from its first moment all the way to its final one, I would see that it starts with a question and ends, which is kind of a new beginning, with an answer. It all starts with and because of a question. As long as a human being has no question, the impulse to seek will not be there. And yet we know this is never the case. Everyone is seeking something. This seeking is implanted into the very nature of what it is to be alive. As soon as we are born, it begins. As soon as we wake up in the morning, it begins. No matter from what species we are, a newborn baby hardly out of the mother's womb has an innate seeking for nourishment and contact. And as we get older and our ego sense develops, we wake up each morning with this ego identity firmly fixed in place after a night of sleeping has suspended it for a time. It is in this waking state that we are immediately thrown into the field of time and space, name and form, and where we will be constantly thinking about something and acting for some intended result. Thus, we also enter the field of cause and effect. Time. Everything here that can be known and experienced has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and all of it moves forward following a particular and mostly predictable trajectory. I often call this my era, or my lifespan. Space. I exist and live out my time-bound life in a fixed place called my planet, my country, my home, my body. I am here, and everything I see, feel, and know is also fixed here in this place. Name. Every object that I know and experience has a name that I am taught and learn, and once the object is named and I know its name, I call it in existence. I also make myself into a kind of object with a name, and so I say, I am Hali. Form. Everything with a name also has some form, whether that form be gross or subtle. And this named and formed object quickly becomes my reality in that I identify it as being separate from the name and form I call me. For I too exist in time and space. I too have a name and a form. Added to this, I have 5 senses and a mind so that I can experience and know everything that is in existence. And this experiencing and knowing will take place through my actions and my thoughts. Now that all of this has come to be who I am, every day will be about using my inner faculties and with my outer actions to gain knowledge of something through the experience of some doing. In other words, I will be seeking something to know and something to do. For this is who I am. It cannot be any other way. At least I can take comfort in the fact that because this impulse is already hardwired in me, and I am used to doing it in some form or another every day, that when it comes time for me to seek the unsought, know the unknown, or hear the unheard, as it says in the Chandogya Upanishad, I will have at least in my small way already set the precedent. If I feel hunger and thirst, this will drive me to seek out nourishment to sustain my body. And if I feel cold or hot, I will be driven to seek shelter. If I desire pleasure and enjoyment, I will make efforts to find it. And if I have the will to know the secret mixture that makes up a water molecule, that will compel me to go into the laboratory and mix my elements until I find the exact combination that produces it. My seeking nature, with the help of all my internal and external faculties, is all I need to beget answers of every variety, from the most mundane to the most significant. And since I live in a society of people who, like me, are also seekers after something and compelled to find answers to the world's secrets, it is possible, at least in theory, to know everything there is to know about the world in which I live. Or so I think. Until the time comes when I realize that all the knowledge I have accumulated through all the avenues available to me thus far has left me still wanting, still questioning. I have this feeling that no matter how much I know and all the things I find, it always feels like not enough. It always feels incomplete. And this feeling doesn't go away. And if it does, it always comes back. In this realization, I see that I have two choices. I can either give up my search for the answer that will bring me peace of mind and be satisfied with the answers that I already have and that are already there. Or I can unfold an entirely new way of seeking, one that I have not tried before, and that is to seek within. As soon as I realize that there is this other way, one that had been available to me all along and is available to me all the time, and I begin to use it, I become a sage, and the sage meditates. What is it that is found in meditation that is different from what we find through more conventional means? Unfortunately, or fortunately, this cannot be answered unless we meditate. And many throughout history have bravely made this choice, deciding to break with convention, to seek answers for themselves, within themselves. In the Sanskrit language, this seeker is called rishi. From where does yoga scripture arise? We don't have any authors in the strict sense of the word whose lives we can trace, and which could give us a sense of who they were and when they lived. Nor can we say with exact certainty when or where in our human history these scriptures were composed. Throughout the centuries, historians and scholars have made use of some very convincing anthropological and archaeological findings that can place these scriptures in a rough geographic location and time frame. But even the most accomplished of these will tell you that all of these findings are best guesses only and cannot be fully relied upon. And while we're at it, can we even use the term composed? Composition implies authorship, and no one ever left their names on these offerings or told us anything about themselves. All we have are a series of what we could call revelations that through time were shared and passed on from teacher to student through direct transmission in an unbroken oral tradition called parampara, until a time came where they were organized and systematized and much later written down. Ultimately, someone, or many people, or an entire culture began to know it and call it their tradition, their lore, their scriptures. One thing we do know for certain, for we hear it repeated over and over again in the texts of the scriptures, that it is these findings, these revelations, called in Sanskrit shruti, do not come through normal ways of thinking, which is subject-object based and which uses the intellect to draw its conclusions, but rather it comes through meditation, which is direct experience. It is easy to think that we are talking about a certain era in history at a particular location and that these meditating sages or rishis existed then, and I today am at best the recipient of their ancient wisdom and should be content with trying to recreate their findings within myself. I have heard somewhere that these wise ones of the past spent much time in meditation, figured something out that was of great significance, had many important revelations as to the underlying nature of reality, and that these discoveries were communicated and taught and preserved through oral tradition, then written down in words transposed into what today we call scripture. Fast forward a few years, or many years, a few generations or many generations, and I today become the recipient of that tradition of knowledge and begin to consume it as if it was meant for my personal digestion. In this way, knowledge, in Sanskrit gyan, is something inherited from the past as a kind of bequeathal for myself in the present. It becomes information. In everything from philosophy to religion, from history to politics, physics, mathematics, music, painting, poetry, and the list goes on. We are the ones who, in this moment, have to bear the responsibility of understanding what we ourselves did not unfold, create, or discover. And to me, this feels like an inadequate and inefficient way of learning. At best, it provides me with the wonderment and inspiration that is needed for me to courageously forge my own path. But at worst, it leaves me overwhelmed by how much there is to find and how little time I am actually given to do the work of acquiring so much knowledge. Furthermore, I feel unqualified to take up the task of so much understanding, and I'm left with this notion that it was those masters of the past who had the courage, the luck, the power, the time, lived in the right era when things were less complicated, etc. And I, here and now, have none of that. I have spent much of my life studying the scriptures of the yoga tradition, scriptures that were born in a land we call India, and today presented as words in print that someone from the past begun the process whereby it was passed down to me. Yet at some point I realized, because I actually had a very, very good teacher, that scripture consumed in this way does not work. It can lead to an unavoidable and fundamental misunderstanding of the wisdom these texts describe. If I were to read the Upanishads, for example, only as a series of fascinating spiritual lessons that some other person in some other time is telling me, then the full appreciation of their beauty and wisdom, and more importantly, their ability to transform my own thinking through direct experience, would be lost. And it would always be someone else's wisdom and transformation, but never truly my own. The question must now be asked: is there any other way of reading something, scriptural or otherwise, other than as a separate person reading something that a separate person wrote? The rishis would say with a resounding certainty that yes, there is. I can imagine them saying, because I am saying it now and realizing it now, that the work they did is the work I am doing, and that the difference in time and space, name and form matters not. The rishi is me. The rishi is I, is you, is he and she and they, and everyone who challenges the old modes of knowing that keep us in a perpetual state of wanting something more, seeking it and never finding it. When I redirect the beam of my awareness and knowing from the external to the internal, I am a rishi. And here is where it gets really interesting. No matter where, when, or who the particular rishi is, in meditation, what is found is always the same. The words used to describe it may be different, but the essence is one. As we said in the beginning of this talk, it all starts with a question. In this case, several questions. 1. Is there a cause of this world? And if so, what is it? Is there an unchanging source of this world of unceasing change? 2. Who is this I that wakes up every morning with its sense of identity and separateness? 3. If there is an underlying source of all, is that source the same as the source of I? 4. Why is there suffering, and what is its cause? 5. Is there a solution to this suffering and its causes? Is there a way to be free from it? 6. What is death? What happens to this I when I die? Does anything of me remain? And finally, 7. Do my questions have any answers? If so, where do these answers come from? To quote from my favorite verse of the Upanishads, the Shvetashvatar Upanishad, finding no answers, the inquirers became quiet and began to meditate. This is a very loaded sentence. If in all this seeking they were finding no answers, why? Where were they looking? Who were they looking to? What was it that finally compelled them to become quiet and meditate? In order for me to better understand their process, I compose a little allegorical story in my head. Perhaps this rishi had had these questions for as long as she could remember. And though she always listened intently to what was taught to her by her elders and educators whose knowledge was shared by the culture in which she lived, there was always a tug at her heart that she could not deny, like a blinking light that is always there even when she covered her eyes to try to block it out. And if she ever did succeed in capturing a few moments without this tug, this incessant blink, it would always come back. The questions would inevitably come back, and no one, it seemed, was willing to answer them. At first, she figures that they did not wish to tell her the answers to her questions because they felt it was not the right time, that she was not yet ready for them. And still she would wait and wonder and keep trying to swallow the education she was already being given. And then it comes, the dawning of her very first revelation, which at first is as shocking as it is painful. They don't answer because they don't know. And there it is. They don't know. For if they did, says a line from the Chandogya Upanishad, surely they would have told me. And so now we come back to our two choices. We cannot see a third. The first choice is to stop questioning and to try to be satisfied with what is being taught and believed. Or look again, but somewhere else. And so it begins. Finding no answers, the inquirers became quiet and began to meditate. I imagine our rishi knows that this process, if you could call it that, is not easy and does not happen overnight, but takes time and practice. It takes going into this place of inner watchfulness again and again. It takes as long as it takes. Sometimes we hear in the Upanishads that one's vision opens to the truth in a flash of awakening. Other times we hear that it takes years and years, an entire lifetime, and then some. It is almost comical to now talk about what happens in the meditation process after we have just said that only direct experience and not secondhand descriptions will do. So going forward, let's put the below description to good use as a way to inspire our own seeking. It is said that the rishis knew that if their search was to reveal the truth, that is, if it was to lead them to the direct experience of that which is the fundamental cause of all things that are perceived, sensed, and known, that they would have to withdraw their attention from the world of change and shift that attention inward to the very knowing consciousness, the witness self that watches all the myriad of changes, but who is itself free of them. In meditation, when the awareness shifts from the field of change, to which even the mind belongs, to the one who is just knowing and witnessing these changes, the layers that were acting as coverings to the true self, which itself shines as pure existence and consciousness, would begin to slowly fade. These layers fade because their nature is change, but the true self, whose nature is changeless, never fades. How can it? It is eternally present. It is eternal presence. It is always there as existence, Sat, and consciousness, Chit. It is the source reality, the truth. Entering this state of awareness, which is more like re-entering, is indescribably blissful, Anand, because here, now, the true self is fully recognized. And so it is that the descriptive terms Sat, Chit, Anand, existence, consciousness, bliss, came to be. When the Rishi finds within herself this unchanging absolute field of existence, it is a direct experience and is known to be one and the same everywhere in all beings, whole and indivisible, the fundamental ground of all being. The Sanskrit term given to it is Brahman, which means that which expands. Our Rishi sees that Brahman is that pure existence, Sat, pure consciousness, Chit, and pure bliss, Anand. And as if that wasn't enough, Brahman is realized as the unchanging core of her changing personhood. Brahman in the person, the Rishis called Atma, the self. And just in case we were tempted to make these into two, the Rishis say no, they are one. Atman, the self, is Brahman, the absolute. All is that. He, she, they is that. Time, space, name, form, cause and effect, suffering, enjoying, is that. There is only that, one without a second. Now all the questions boil down to one. What is preventing me from fully realizing this vision of oneness so that my ignorance and suffering ends? And the Rishis called it Maya. We are ready now to begin our study of the wisdom teachings found in the Upanishads. What is an Upanishad? And where do these mystical teachings come from? The term Upanishad is a compound word in the Sanskrit language and is used as a title for a specific grouping of scriptures that are found at the end portion of a larger scriptural tradition called the Vedas. The compound word Upanishad is formed by three root words, Upa, meaning near, Ni, which means down, and Shad, sit. Upa, Ni, Shad. Near, down, sit. If I reverse this, since Sanskrit grammar is in reverse of how it is in English, I get sit down near. This shows us that the teachings set forth in the Upanishads are in dialogue rather than monologue form. The Upanishads are not putting forth a single person's or many persons' revelations as to the essential nature of existence in a faraway time or place where I cannot reach it. Rather, they are a living philosophy in conversation form between a teacher and a student or many students together, whose aim is for us not to be informed by knowledge, but rather transformed by it. So we journey from neti, not this, to iti, this. All is one, and I am united with that. This, the Upanishads say, is yoga. When the five senses are stilled, when the mind is stilled, when the intellect is stilled, that is called the highest state by the wise. They say yoga is this complete stillness in which one enters the unitive state, never to become separate again. This concludes our audio lesson on seeking and the themes in the Upanishads. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.